refutation on the common presupposition that belief in non-sensed objects is fundamentally irrational. In that refutation, I offered several reasons and ideas as to why such a view is incoherent and incorrect, and mentioned that such a view is actually a crude form of empiricism. Now, such a point segues nicely into another common presupposition in life and probably on YouTube that can be formulated like this. 1. Science is the main, or perhaps only, field of study that discovers reality. And 2. Science is the standard by which beliefs can be rationally assessed. Now, I hear this often, whether it be subconsciously or explicitly stated. For example, science replaced the Bible a long time ago, or only beliefs that are quantifiable or empirically tested are rational, so therefore faith is irrational. Nonetheless, despite how widely accepted this belief may be, it is fundamentally false for several reasons. Now, within this paper, I would like to point out the limitations of science as a discipline and examine several assumptions within the discipline of science itself. However, before I do this, I would like to point out that I do not view science as a useless tool. Rather, I hold science to be a very useful tool in exploring and discovering reality. What my main objections are, however, focus on the idea that science is the ultimate tool of discovery, and that only beliefs that can be quantified and tested are rational. For clarity, we shall call this position scientific exclusivism. I've made that up. Within this point, keeping this point in mind, let's examine why science cannot be the revealer of reality, and then examine science presuppositions and limitations. Before we look at the limitations of science, we need to make two key distinctions first. Perhaps the most fundamental point to make is the difference between first and second order disciplines. For example, consider biology, history, and philosophy. Biology and history would be considered first order disciplines. Biology studies living organisms, whereas history studies past event. Philosophy, however, is a second order discipline, meaning that philosophy studies philosophical issues like the principle of being and knowledge, but philosophy can also study other disciplines as well. Since philosophy operates as a self-referential discipline, by asking presuppositional questions about itself and other disciplines, philosophy is more versatile and constructive than other disciplines. Therefore, since science is not a second-order discipline, it cannot answer certain questions without crossing over into philosophy, and therefore science is limited in its explanatory scope. Another key point is that there is no distinction between what is good and bad science, or even what constitutes as the scientific method. Now, I remember when I was growing up, I was taught that the scientific method was observation, hypothesis, trial, and repetition. However, in further studying as I've grown older, such a clear-cut definition is far from universally accepted. For instance, do we follow the scientific method via induction, or should we follow the hypothetical deductive model, or perhaps we should follow an eclectic model? Interestingly, there's no ironed-out methodology or definition for the scientific method. This is exemplified from debates that range from whether science should use adduction or abduction, to disagreements on the basic scientific explanations versus covering law and inferential modes of explanation. The point is that science is not a discipline that can be fitted into a tidy category. Even if such a definition could be constructed, the adequacy of the definition would be philosophical and not scientific in nature. Hence, philosophy is more apt to be the ultimate tool of discovering reality than science could be. Now let's look at some presuppositions and limitations of science. Perhaps the most fundamental problem with the statement that only the quantifiable and empirically tested is rational and true is that such a statement is self-refuting. This statement is self-refuting for the proposition itself cannot be quantified or empirically tested, and therefore by its own standard is proven false. Such a statement is not a statement of science, but rather is a philosophical statement about science. Hence, credence is given to my original distinction between first and second order disciplines. Along with the self-refuting nature of scientific exclusivism, there are at least three presuppositions that are inherent in such a position that are necessary in grounding science as a rational discipline. However, each of these presuppositions are either philosophical in nature or are brute givens which cannot be discovered outside philosophy without begging the question in favor of science. The first presupposition that one must hold is that the human senses are reliable and give accurate information about a mind-independent physical world instead of mere information about our sense impressions. In other words, our human senses must give us real and accurate information about our surroundings rather than information about the feelings and images retained as a consequence of our sense experience. Moreover, how does one discover the possibility of the supernatural, i.e., something transcendent of the natural world, by exclusively examining the natural world? Regardless of one's beliefs of these two issues, these questions are philosophical in nature and not scientific. Hence, science cannot answer the questions without begging the question. Therefore, if we are to assume that science is the only ultimate revealer of truth and reality, we must accept the rational realism position of our sense perceptions, which may or may not be true. The second presupposition that grounds the truth and rationality of science is that our minds are rational, and that the universe is rational in such a way that our minds can know it. In other words, science presupposes that there is uniformity in nature, and that we can legitimately infer from the past to the future, as well as from examined cases to unexamined cases of the same kind. For example, hydrogen and oxygen combine to form water in past examined cases. However, should we assume that such events will continue in future unexamined cases? It would appear that science assumes the reality of universals and the uniformity of nature to justify induction. Yet these assumptions cannot themselves be justified inductively via science, for this is a philosophical issue. Hence, if one tries to answer the question via science, he would be begging the question. The third presupposition that is held within the discipline of science is the existence of boundary conditions. A boundary condition is a given value that is not accounted for by science. For example, consider Newton's law of motion, stated as v equals v sub o plus 1/2 at. V sub o is a boundary condition. To clarify, consider a bullet being fired from a gun. The initial velocity depends on the gun and not the equation of motion. Other such boundary conditions are the mass of protons, the rate of the expansion of the universe, the speed of light, etc. The mere existence of such values, which cannot be discovered via science, has to be assumed in order for science to be rationally grounded. Therefore, these brute givens cannot be verified by science without begging the question. Lastly, it would be fallacious to assume that science can account for everything. In a popular debate between Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Peter Atkins, Craig points out this point, to which Atkins asks for several examples, to which Craig gives 5, namely, science cannot account for logic and mathematics, science cannot account for metaphysical truths, science cannot account for moral judgments, science cannot account for aesthetic judgments, and science cannot account for itself. Let's quickly unpack these points. First, science cannot account for logic and mathematics because science presupposes these in order to function, so if someone were to try to explain these via science, they'd be arguing in a circle. Second, science cannot account for metaphysical truths like there are other minds, for science only can discover the physical matter of the brain and not the aboutness or the thought of the mind. Third, science cannot account for moral judgments because you cannot establish via science that the Nazi scientists, for example, during the Holocaust are wrong in comparison to postmodern scientists. Fourth, beauty cannot be scientifically proven, for beauty is like an abstract object as good and evil. Fifth, lastly, science cannot be proven via science because it contains unimprovable assumptions like the speed of light or other boundary conditions. In conclusion, the presupposition that science, 1, is the ultimate or perhaps only revealer of reality, and 2, it is the standard by which beliefs can be quantified and assessed as rational, is inherently biased and false. First of all the disciplines that could be considered as the ultimate discipline, philosophy would win out due to its second-order nature and its ability to examine the presuppositions within itself as well as other disciplines. Second, science is not as clear and concise as some may think, for the scientific method is far from being universally accepted or defined via inductivism. Third, such a position of scientific exclusivity is self-refuting, for the proposition cannot be quantified or empirically tested. Fourth, there are at least 3 presuppositions within science that cannot be accounted for by science, and thus are not necessarily true, nor are they answerable outside of philosophy without begging the question in regards to science. Finally, there are at least 5 areas that cannot be proven via science, namely logic and mathematics, metaphysics, moral judgments, aesthetics, and science itself.